Hello and welcome to Chapter 8. In Chapter 8, it goes into great detail on all the different bones of the body. You start with more bones as a fetus, and then some of them fuse, and most adults have about 206 bones in your body, which, did you know, a quarter of them are in your feet? How's that for details that you don't need to know? Anyway, there are a lot of bones in the body, but what we're going to look at, let me show you the diagram on, so this is the diagram in your textbook. If the bone is on this diagram, it is testable, okay? Just because we have to limit it. We could go, the skull itself has all sorts of bones in it, and then there's all sorts of different details in terms of the carpals and the metacarpals and the phalanges, but we're going to stick mainly to this detail to go through it. Now, there's two divisions of the bones, and that is, or the skeleton, and that's why this is highlighted. There's the axial, which is basically the head, the vertebrae, and the ribs. And then you've got your appendicular, which is your shoulder girdle, your hip girdle, and your appendages. Okay, so that's what the colors are here. This is what I would like you to know for this chapter. And yeah, there will be a label that diagram here, or yeah, on the test. Good. Now, another thing about bones is that there are some surface markings that have names. And these are the general ones. Oops, there we go. These are the general names of them, and it'll make more sense when you actually look at the bone. So a condyle is a rounded knob, and it usually fits into a fossa, which is a space. So on the end of your bones, and I'll show you when we look at the arm bones, you have a condyle, which is basically a knob. A fossa, a facet, is a flat surface. A head is like a ball on the top. So quite often you look at the head of the humerus, and if you're marking to do any sort of injection sites or any muscle activity or marking, you'll go and find the head of your humerus. When you look at projections, the name of them is basically based on the size. If you have a ridge, you have a crest, and the most common one there is the iliac crest, which is on the ridge on your hips. Then you have the epicondyle, which is the bump above the condyle. So condyle is the surface where the articulating surface, and epi means above. I'll show you that when we look at the arm bones. A process is a raised part, and usually a process is where bone or muscle attachment occurs. A spine is a sharp process, and then there's different names for sort of heads. A trochanter is on the femur, and a tubercular is on the humerus. To me, I'm not sure what the difference is other than trochanters, only on the femur. And then you have a tuberosity, which is usually a place for muscle attachment. So let's look at these ones, and a great place to look at these ones is the arm bone. So if you look at, oh, is it getting dizzy yet? There we go. So you don't need to know the vertebrae in this much detail, but you do need to know the terminology. So a process is something that sticks out. You have your spinal process on your vertebrae, which is the bump that sticks out into the spine, and transverse is the one that sticks out sideways. So that is a process. Then when we look at your humerus, this is where you can see, so here's your tuberosity, which is a bump right on the radius, and a tuberosity is a place where there's a muscle attachment. So this bone is where you would attach your bicep. When you look at a head is basically a big ball on top. And here's the cranial process here, which is again another bump that sticks out. Where's my other processes? So here is your iliac crest up here, which is the crest of your ilium. It's the ridge. Yeah, see right here, the big ridge. If possible, if you want to see your bones, have a go get a roasted chicken and then take apart the skeleton. Okay, so those are your processes, or the things that stick out. There's also a whole set of terms for depressions, or things that go in, and they're named based on their size. So a fossa is just a depression, a fovea is a pit, and a sulcus is a groove. The most common fossa is your antecubital fossa, so which is the dip on ante is against the cubit, which is your elbow, antecubital fossa, and that will be your ACF, as it eventually gets called, because that is where you put a lot of your injection sites. A fovea is a small pit, and a sulcus is a groove, and we'll show that in a bit. Then you have passages. A canal goes right through the bone. A fissure is a long slit. A foramen is a big opening. A meatus is a tube-like opening. An example of that one is the external auditory meatus, which is basically the bone where your ear canal goes. And then a sinus is a cavity inside your bone. So when you look for those terms, again, you don't need to know the specifics, but I want you to be aware of them. So inside the skull, you have your sinus cavity. Here's a beautiful external auditory meatus, which allows for your ear bone to go through. These little holes here are processes, canals that allow for blood vessels and nerves to come out of. Good. Inside your skull, you have your sinuses, which are open. Here's your sutures. Oh, I'm trying to find a sulcus. So here's a good example of your sinuses inside your bones, inside cavities. Okay. Anyway, pay attention to those. So in this chapter, although there are huge amounts of information, I want you to know your processes. I want you to know your bones. And then another thing I want you to know is your vertebrae names. So and your numbers. You've got 7 cervical vertebrae. You have 12 thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar vertebrae. You have, get rid of that, 5 lumbars, 5 sacral, and then you have a coccyx, which is fused together. This is important too. So although there is a great amount of detail in this chapter, and go through and look at it and find your processes. Oh, the xiphoid process is a good one. Anytime you may have been taught how to do CPR, you feel for the bottom and then you go 2 fingers below, and then you want to, sorry, not your CPR, your Heimlich maneuver, you want to go below it and push up. And even when you're giving CPR, you want to go above it. You want to avoid this xiphoid process because it can break off and it can puncture the internal organs. Then you also have notches, which we didn't talk about. Notches are also very common markers when you look at. So one very common marker is this one, and this one too, the suprasternal notch. It sounds like it's tricky, but if you look at the fact that supra means above, sternal notch, so it's basically the notch at the top of the sternum, and very good for marking. And then you go down and you mark these here. Okay, so for this chapter, it's page 120, 117 and 124, and then your terminology, and that will basically be it. But it is really cool to look at the rest of the parts, just to look at it. Again, you don't need to memorize it. When we look at the epicondyle, so we talked about the condyle being the articulatory surface, the epicondyle is above it. And here's a beautiful example of using your medial and lateral terms. Lateral will mean it's on the outside, medial will mean it's on the inside. Okay, and when you put all these bits together, you get the words. Good, and that is the end of the skeleton.